Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Bob Kincaid, thank you so very much, and welcome everyone to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a pleasure to be with you. We are, as many of you will recognize, 30 minutes later in our start on Tuesday than we are on our Monday and Wednesday program. So we'll be doing an abbreviated program today. We'll be doing a 90-minute session together rather than the full 120 minutes that we do the other 2 days of each week. It is a pleasure to be with you. I trust that your day is going well. I trust that your willingness to commit a portion of your very valuable time of this beautiful midweek day to this program will contribute to the quality of your day, and I mean that. If you are having a good day, I hope that the time you spend with us today will make a good day an even better one. That is my goal. That is what we're about, and that's what I trust and I hope will happen. We would love to hear from you on some of the issues we are dealing with here at the Virtual Center. We have a phone number, and the purpose of the number is basically to get you on the air so that your ideas or questions or considerations or thoughts or curiosities or concerns or whatever you might have related to these subjects can be shared not just with me but with our other listeners as well. We have reserved this phone line. The number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. If you would like to communicate with me directly, one-on-one via email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. In our program yesterday, for those of you who were with us, you'll recall, and for those of you who were not with us yesterday, let me kind of set the stage for where we are. We began moving toward an analysis and an investigation of, I think, an incredibly enlightening and profound book on the Federalist Papers by Garry Wills. The title of the book is Explaining America. It focuses specifically on the Federalist Papers, which of course are the papers written in the New York ratifying campaign of 1787-1788 in an effort to encourage the citizens of New York to support candidates for the ratifying convention who would be in favor of the Constitution, Federalists, rather than those who were opposed to it, the so-called anti-Federalists. And as we know, there were 85 Federalist Papers. We spent several weeks here at the Virtual Center looking at Garry Wills' book, Inventing America, on the Declaration of Independence, on Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Now we're about to enter into a discussion and an analysis, I trust, of his book on the Federalist Papers, on the meaning and the essence of the Constitution as that meaning is elaborated, explained in the Federalist Papers. We spent a little bit of time in a program last week talking about the general organization of the Explaining America book. And one of the things that we pointed out is that 1/3 of the book is spent, the first third, is spent focusing principally on the main authors of the Federalist Papers. You'll recall that all the Federalist Papers were signed under the same name, Publius, but that there were three authors of the Federalist Papers: John Jay, attorney in New York; Alexander Hamilton, also a resident of the state of New York; and the third contributor to the Federalist Papers was James Madison, as we know, of Virginia. So when Virginia's ratifying convention concluded with ratification in the state of Virginia in June of 1788, Madison made his way to New York and began to contribute to a series of papers supporting ratification in New York. The bulk of the papers obviously had their origin in New York, and they were written by Alexander Hamilton. In fact, what we find is that John Jay, for a number of reasons, one of them being health, probably contributed no more than 7 or 8 papers. And so the bulk, 90-95% of the Federalist Papers were written by either Alexander Hamilton or James Madison. And some of the most famous ones, obviously, Federalist number 10, Federalist number 51, were written by James Madison. But the fact of the matter is, the grunt work, if you will, the day-to-day output of putting these papers in the New York State newspapers on a regular basis belonged to Alexander Hamilton. And in looking at the organization of the Garry Wills book, one of the things that we recognized was that the first third of his book focused principally on Madison and Hamilton. Later on, one of his later chapters addresses John Jay specifically, and John Jay's contributions principally in the area of foreign policy, of what the Constitution would do to enhance the credibility of America's status in the world and America's political clout in the world of nations. But the bulk of the papers, as we mentioned, were written by Madison and Hamilton. And Garry Wills devotes the first third of his book, to a careful look at the political positions of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. And what he basically does in the first 2 sections of his book, there are 4 sections of this book. It is divided into 4 parts. The first 2 parts focus on Madison and Hamilton. And the first part addresses Madison, but more specifically, the extent to which Madison was responsible for ideas and contributions in this campaign, in this Federalist paper venture, that could easily have been written by Hamilton. In other words, the title of it is Madison as Hamiltonian. And then the second section addresses Hamilton as Madisonian. What Garry Wills is trying to suggest is that despite the stereotypes of these 2 people and what they stood for politically, the fact of the matter is, whereas most people tend to separate the 2 because they really didn't seem to stand for the same thing, Madison seemed to have much more of a commitment to the principles of republicanism and the mass participation of the citizens in the political process. Hamilton, on the other hand, is pretty much known for his stance on the idea of strong, stable, secure central government. And what form it took, or the role that citizens in it, to Hamilton, was secondary to the success of the of the political fabric itself. So while these two stereotypes seem to establish the fact that the two gentlemen were quite different in their political outlook and political preferences, Garry Wills takes a third of his book to point out that there's much more to link these two people than there is to separate them. The mere fact that they were able to participate together in this monumental venture, which totaled 85 separate papers on the Constitution of the United States, suggests that there was more, that they had more in common than we tend to realize, at least at first blush. And what Garry Wills sets out to do is to point out that there's quite a bit in the Federalist Papers written by Madison that, unless we knew who the author was, we would swear they were written by Hamilton. But then in his second part of his book, he reverses that process and says the same thing about Hamilton. And so what we begin to get is a sense that the differences between these two were secondary to the bases on which they tended to agree. And of course, the focus of their agreement was ratification of the Constitution of the United States. And where we began, where we decided to begin, and this was yesterday's program, was to look at Hamilton's principal contribution to the convention, the Constitutional Convention itself. Madison says in his notes that up until the 18th of June, through the last few days of May and the first 2+ weeks of June, Hamilton basically was invisible in the Constitutional Convention. For the time he was there, he said very little, he made very little comment. But then on the 18th of June, all that changed. Hamilton took the floor at the beginning of the day on the 18th of June and kept the floor throughout the day until the convention adjourned at the end of the day. And depending on who you read, Hamilton's speech encompassed either 5 or 6 hours. It was detailed, and it was a blockbuster. Because when Hamilton finished at the end of the day, the only thing that Madison comments in his notes is that when Mr. Hamilton sat down, the convention voted to adjourn. And if you look at some of the letters that are exchanged among members of the convention who sat there and listened to Hamilton's speech, you get the impression that the convention was stunned by some of the things that Hamilton says. Not spellbound. This was not Patrick Henry speaking. And you know, we've talked in the past here at the Virtual Center about Patrick Henry and his oratorical skills. Patrick Henry could hold an audience. He could sway an audience. Hamilton was an attorney, but he was a very, very good one. Rather, the convention's reaction or lack of reaction to Hamilton's speech seems principally to be because the convention was dumbfounded by some of the things that Hamilton said. 2 or 3 times during the course of the speech, Hamilton apologized to the convention for his bluntness, his abruptness. Madison in his notes makes the comment that Hamilton at times almost apologized for the fact that he was saying some things that members of the convention really didn't want to hear. In other words, what Hamilton presented was one of those what we call in-your-face presentations, which basically forced the convention to face head-on the realities of the challenge that faced them. He chose this day, the 18th of June, principally because at that time the two major proposals for constitutional change were on the table. A little bit of background for those that may not be right familiar with some of this detail. The purpose of the convention was to ratify the Articles of Confederation. But the fact of the matter is, once the convention opened in late May, Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia, in addressing the convention, the delegates convened, made the point that while the purpose that brought these representatives of their states to Philadelphia for this convention was to revise the articles in order to make sure that the government was adequate to what the term that Hamilton uses is the exigencies of the Union. Obviously, the implication is that the Articles of Confederation were woefully deficient in meeting the needs of the Union, the needs of the nation. And the convention was called to revise the articles so that they would work better. Edmund Randolph, in his opening address, launched into an attack on the articles in order to make the point that most members realized that the articles were beyond repair, that they were so weak and so deficient in so many different areas that to spend time trying to revise them was a waste of time. And Randolph reported to the group that a number of them have gotten together and put together an alternative proposal for a totally new government which would meet the needs of the Union, the needs of the nation. And that plan, as we know, was written by James Madison, and it has been called throughout in all our history books as the Virginia Plan. Some textbooks refer to it as the large state plan because Madison's whole approach toward the new government was to proportion power according to population. In other words, the largest states would have the most representatives in Congress. Therefore, the largest states would pack the most punch. They would have the most influence on legislation that would be passed. Obviously, Madison's Virginia plan threatened to derail the convention before it got even underway, because many of the delegates from the small states were unwilling to accept secondary status to the large states. Many of them pointed out, for example, that under Madison's Virginia plan, they didn't call it Madison's plan because his name wasn't on it. It was introduced by Randolph, but we know from the records that it was Madison's proposal. But under his proposal, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New York would run the nation, because they had the most population. And consequently, the small states would, in accepting the Virginia plan, would be accepting secondary status in the new Union. Under the Articles of Confederation, all 13 states were independent and sovereign. Therefore, they were equal in that each state had one vote. Under the Articles of Confederation, a state could have 2 representatives in Congress. It could have as many as 7 representatives in Congress. But when it came time to vote on legislation, the state only had one vote. So it was up to the delegates representing that state to work out their differences so that the state could cast its vote, either yea or nay, depending on the particular question on the table. So under the Articles of Confederation, the small states had equal voting power to the large states. Under the Virginia plan, they would lose that. So consequently, many of the representatives from the smaller states were obviously threatening to walk out of the convention. And at that point in time, the small states got together and put forth an alternative proposal, which our textbooks usually refer to as the New Jersey Plan. And the reason they call it that is because the New Jersey Plan was introduced by William Patterson, governor of New Jersey. Actually, and I think I'm correct here, I'm pretty sure of this, I believe that the actual plan itself was put together principally by Roger Sherman of Connecticut. But it was introduced by Patterson. We know that the Virginia plan was written by Madison, introduced by Governor Randolph of Virginia. So the New Jersey plan is on the table, and debate is just about to begin on the New Jersey plan. And without getting into the details of the differences between the two plans, let me say that what the New Jersey plan attempted to do was to address the problems which brought them to the convention in the first place, but at the same time preserve the basic structure of the Articles of Confederation. In other words, the New Jersey plan would preserve the nation as a confederation of independent states. Therefore, it would preserve the equality of the states in terms of voting power. But at the same time, it would address some of the concerns and some of the issues which had produced the Virginia plan. One of the things that the New Jersey plan provided for example, was direct requisitions, financial contributions of the states to Congress. In other words, under the Articles, Congress had to request money from the states because it did not have the power to tax. The New Jersey plan didn't give Congress the power to tax either, but the New Jersey plan was definitive in its requirement that the states contribute financially to the needs of the central government. So the New Jersey plan was an effort to address some of the major problems of the nation without changing the basic structure of the Articles of Confederation. It still preserved Confederation. It still preserved the idea of equality among the states. It is then at that point, after the New Jersey plan is on the table, after the Virginia plan has been somewhat discussed, everybody knows what's in the Virginia plan, what the proposals are, what the positives are, and what the negatives are. And obviously the New Jersey plan is put together trying to incorporate as many of the positives from the other plan as possible without changing the basic structure of the Confederation. It's at that point that Hamilton decides that it's time to speak. And what we did yesterday, in yesterday's program, was to address the first portion of Hamilton's speech, in which Hamilton took on the nature of the problem facing the Congress. All of this is based principally, not exclusively, on James Madison's notes, because that's the best source we have. Yates, Robert Yates of New York, also took notes of Hamilton's speech, but they aren't nearly as detailed as Madison's. Because Yates was an anti-federalist, and therefore Yates would be opposed to Hamilton from the very beginning. But one of the more interesting things about Yates, Madison included this in his notes, is that in talking about Hamilton and Hamilton's proposal, Madison made the point that Yates had attributed a remark, had made a remark, supposedly based on what Hamilton said in reference to the New Jersey plan, that, quote, it was a plan, and this is the quote from, supposedly from Hamilton, it was pork still with a little change of sauce, unquote. In other words, Yates, according to Madison, Yates told him that Hamilton had said that the New Jersey plan amounted to pork still with a little change of sauce. In other words, it was a little bit different from the Articles of Confederation, but basically it really didn't address the problems at all. So Madison's notes are clearly the most comprehensive. And what Madison does once Hamilton takes the floor is he makes the point that Hamilton apologized to the group for the fact that he hadn't said anything up until this point in the convention. And part of the reason was because of what he called the superior abilities, age, and experience of the other delegates. In other words, Hamilton is being very shrewd here, and he's playing to his audience. He's saying, I haven't said anything to now because, to be very honest with you, I'm intimidated by the quality of the people here. In other words, you people know so much more than I do that I didn't feel myself worthy of contributing to the discussion until now, when no longer could I keep quiet, is basically what he's saying. And then the second reason he gives for his silence is the fact that he's a minority in his own delegation. New York had 3 representatives at the convention: Lansing, Yates, and Hamilton. Lansing and Yates were both anti-federalists. So Hamilton was a minority in his own delegation. Consequently, he was reluctant to speak because never did he speak for New York. He was only speaking for himself. So therefore, he had to pick his place wisely. But at this point, he said, when it looked like, and then he makes the statement right at the very beginning, that basically he did not see either plan as being sufficient. Madison says he was obliged, therefore, to declare himself unfriendly to both plans. So obviously the reason that Hamilton chose to speak on the 18th of June is because the 2 plans on the table, the result of the convention was going to be one or the other or a combination of both. And at that point, Hamilton, who believed that neither one of them was what we needed, figured that it's now or never. So he took the 18th of June, and he basically took up the entire day on the 18th of June. He opened his speech by talking about what he called the essentials of effective government. The things that government had to have in order to be successful. And he numbered them. At least Madison numbered them in his notes. The first one, he called them the great and essential principles necessary for the support of government. And Hamilton lays out 5 of these. The first one, he says, is a constant active interest in supporting it. In other words, if government is going to work, it's going to have not just the short-term support of its people, but the long-term active involvement of people. People must support it. The second thing that is a necessary of government is power. Government must have power. Hamilton says men love power. So consequently, government must have the authority to exercise its will. And its will must be the dominant will. It can't be one of a competing number of alternative sources of power. It has to be the ultimate power. The third thing that government must have, an essential quality, is what he calls the habitual attachment of the people. People must be inclined to support this government. People must believe that it's their government. The fourth thing that government must have is the ability to use force. Hamilton uses the term coercion of arms. Coercion of laws or coercion of arms. Government must have the power to enforce its will. It must have the power of coercion. And then finally, influence. Hamilton says that in order to be successful, government must exude influence. It must be able to dispense, this is what Madison said in his notes, dispense those regular honors and emoluments which produce an attachment to government itself. Government must be able to reward people for their support, which means it must have power and it must have influence with the people. So he lays out those 5 things. And then Hamilton says, the problem we face here in America is that under the current system, the Articles of Confederation, it's the state governments that have all of those things, not the Union. It's the states that have the loyalty of the people. It's the states that people feel they belong to. They don't call themselves Americans. They call themselves Virginians or Pennsylvanians or Rhode Islanders or New Hampshireites or whatever. But so they don't see themselves as citizens of a nation. They see themselves as citizens of a state. It's the states that have the power to coerce. It's the states that have the power to enforce or impose their will. It's the states that have the influence and the authority to give rewards and emoluments. In other words, it's the state governments, not the central government, that has the power to honor people and to build support in itself. Hamilton says almost all the weight of all of these is on the side of the states. and must continue so as long as the states continue to exist. And then he goes through some history and lays out from ancient history the fact that confederations in the past have organized themselves in a number of different ways, of different forms, or different structures. And he said, other examples instruct us in the same truth. The Swiss cantons have scarce any union at all. In other words, the one thing he points out is that if you go back through history and you look at confederation structures where units or counties or areas have come together to form nations, they always have the same problem. And that is that people see themselves as citizens of the entity that was, not the new entity that was created. And he goes through history and points out example after example. And he deals with Switzerland. And he say the Swiss cantons have practically no union at all. And have more than once been at war with each other. Then he asked the question, this is where we ended yesterday's program. How then are all of these evils to be avoided? Hamilton says, only by such a complete sovereignty in the general government as will turn all the strong principles and passions above mentioned on its side. Somehow, the only way to solve these problems is to create a general government, a union, that is strong enough and powerful enough to win over all of these required qualities that are necessary for government to be successful. The loyalty to the people, the active support of the people, the ability of government to enforce its will, the ability to coerce, the ability to reward support, the ability to award honors and give people honors and other forms of emoluments which make them feel good and make them feel part. In other words, a government that is strong enough to win not only the political and physical support of citizens, but the psychological support as well, so that our people will begin to say, I'm a citizen of the United States of America. That's what Hamilton is saying. And the point at which we ended our program yesterday was to suggest that so long as the states remained sovereign, in other words, under the New Jersey plan that was on the table, Hamilton says, does the scheme of New Jersey produce this effect? Does it afford any substantial remedy whatever? On the contrary, he says, it labors under great defects, and the defect of some of its provisions will destroy the efficacy of others. Oh, it gives direct revenue to Congress, he says, but this will not be sufficient. This is not enough. In other words, as long as the states remain sovereign in a confederation type of structure, there's no way that you can address or solve the problems we have. Basically, what Hamilton comes down to is that the only way we can do this is to do away with the states. You can imagine the reaction in the convention when Hamilton said that. When in fact the only reason they were there was because they had been chosen to represent their states. And all of them were under instructions to attend the convention and report back to the states on what was happening in the convention. Hamilton goes through the New Jersey plan item by item. And he says, how can we make this work? How can we set up a system where the states contribute to the national government? He said, you can't have two sovereigns. You can't have sovereign state and a sovereign central government as well. Of course, it's interesting because later on in the Federalist Papers, that's exactly what they tried to suggest we've got is dual sovereignty. But to this convention, Hamilton is saying, everybody knows sovereignty is power, absolute power. It can only be in one place, is what Hamilton is saying. If the states have it, then the central government can't have it, and vice versa. He said, how are we going to decide how states contribute? Granted, the New Jersey plan says that the states will give financial support to Congress. But how are we going to determine how much? How are we going to do that? What standard? Hamilton says, to what standard will you resort? Land? You can't use that, he says. Compare Holland with Russia. Russia's huge. Holland is little. But financially, Holland is so much wealthier and could contribute so much more than could Russia. Or, he said, how about France and England? Compare them with the other countries of Europe. They're not the biggest, but they're the wealthiest and would make the most meaningful contribution. Or, he said, if you come into the United States, you can compare Pennsylvania with North Carolina. So land, just the land area itself, is not going to cut it. Then he says, take numbers of inhabitants. Are we going to have a quota based on the number of inhabitants? He said, you'll find that this is equally unjust. Then he goes into the finances. And this is particularly interesting. He said, compare New Jersey and North Carolina, not being commercial states, but contributing to the wealth of the commercial ones, can never bear quotas assessed by the ordinary rules of proportion. He singles out New Jersey and North Carolina. And basically what he's saying is that at that time in history, the nations that could, the areas or the states that could make the most meaningful financial contribution to the nation were commercial states. Money and power was in commerce. New Jersey and North Carolina were not commercial states, but rather they contributed to the success and wealth of commercial states. They can never, he says, bear quotas assessed by the ordinary rules of proportion. What he's saying is that if the name of the game is commerce, you've got some states that control it and maximize their benefits from it. But you've got other states like North Carolina and New Jersey that are not commercial states, but they feed into the commerce of those states. They are financial dependencies on the commercial power of adjoining states. They are like the state that I'm sitting in right now, West Virginia. They are extractive states who contribute raw materials to the commercial benefit of other states. Therefore, they are not deriving the direct benefit of their own wealth. Basically, the term that economists use today is that they are effectively colonial economies. They are economies that feed into the commercial and later on the industrial power of other states. Prior to the Civil War in America, the southern states were agricultural and raw material producers. They fed raw materials into the industries of the North. The South in the early 19th century had effectively become colonies of the New England states, of the northern states. And just as the 13 colonies felt that the only way they could control their own wealth was to separate from the mother country, so John C. Calhoun believed that the only way the southern states could realize their own wealth was to separate from the Union. This gets into the whole issue of the flow of wealth. Here's Hamilton in 1787 laying out the realities of a modern commercial capitalistic economy, not industrial yet. The industry was in the mother country. America did not have industry yet. Hamilton's going to take care of that when he becomes Secretary of the Treasury under Washington with his financial plan. But at this point, he's talking about commercial power, the influence and the wealth of the commercial states. And he identifies two, New Jersey and North Carolina, that are not commercial states. Therefore, you can't hold them accountable for financial contributions that are anywhere near what the commercial states could provide. What he's doing is pointing out that this is one reason why the New Jersey plan can't work. Because it benefits some states at the expense of others. And they said, whence then is the national revenue to be drawn? From commerce? You can't do it. Then he talks about equality of suffrage among the states. In other words, the states are insistent, the small states are insistent, that they have an equal vote with the large state. Basically, his conclusion is that Mr. Patterson's plan provides no remedy for the issues that face the nation. Consequently, he's drawn to the following conclusion. What then is to be done, Hamilton says. Here, this is Madison talking because these are Madison's notes. Here he was embarrassed. The extent of the country to be governed discouraged him. The expense of a general government was so formidable, unless there was such a diminution of expense on the side of the state governments as the case would admit. This is the point at which Hamilton drops the bomb. He was embarrassed. But the size of this nation, he said, is so great, and the expense of a government to govern it will be so formidable that we would have to find a way to reduce the expenses currently undertaken by the state governments. If the new government is going to be as expensive as we think it is, then we're going to have to find a way to divert money from states to the central government. And then he says, and this is the bomb, if they were extinguished, the states, he was persuaded that great economy might be obtained by substituting a general government. He didn't mean, however, to shock the public opinion by proposing such a measure. On the other hand, he saw no other necessity for declining it. The states are not necessary for any of the great purposes of commerce, revenue, or agriculture. Subordinate authorities, he was aware, would be necessary. There must be district tribunals, corporations for local purposes. But the vast and expensive apparatus now appertaining to the states don't need it. Hamilton proposes that the cost of government, the sum total of government of 13 independent states, be replaced by all of that expense going into the support of one general government over the whole thing. And the only way to pay for it is to extinguish the states. It's a wonder at that point that a number of the delegates didn't walk out of the convention. He admitted that there had to be subordinate authorities. There had to be district tribunals. There had to be corporations for local purposes. But there didn't have to be state governments. It's kind of like an example, and I'm using the state that I'm sitting in, which is West Virginia, as an example. In West Virginia, which is one of the smallest states population-wise, West Virginia has less than 3 million residents, about 2.8 million, I believe. West Virginia is divided into 55 counties. Each county has its own commission. Each county has its own independent school board. Each county has its own independent superintendent of schools. Each county has its own police force. We have the state police, but we also have county police. The county I'm in, Raleigh County, we have the Raleigh County Sheriff's Department. Some of the roads are county roads maintained by the counties, and supported by the taxes from the residents of those counties. Other roads in West Virginia are state roads maintained by the State Department of Highways. For years, I've been here 23 years. Ever since I've been here, people have been making proposals that the state of West Virginia could save a fortune if we abolished some of the counties and created regional governments. If we linked 3 and 4 and 5 counties together and had one larger regional commission and governor and police force and all the rest of it, you would save all the money for every one of the individual school systems and police departments and all the rest of it. I think you can anticipate the reaction that those proposals received, especially from county employees and from teachers in the respective counties. Administratively and financially, it makes perfect sense. Politically, it's a disaster. It's going to take somebody with a lot more power and influence than anybody who's here now to be able to pull this off against the vested interests that each of these counties and local systems have built up over the years. That's the same challenge that Hamilton and the Federalists faced with the Constitutional Convention and getting the Constitution of the United States ratified. You are asking the states to give up power that they have had since the very beginning. You are asking people who have made themselves prominent within their localities, within their counties, within their states. They've become prominent people. But once you shift the arena from a state arena to a national arena, then many of these local power sources, these very powerful people within their states, may not even be known in the other states. So consequently, any kind of a change like this would directly detract from their influence and their power and their prestige. They have a vested personal interest in opposing and fighting the creation of national government. They are your anti-federalists. And they may come up with all of the philosophical reasons, and they go to Montesquieu, and they go to all of these ancient sources, and they go to the 17th century opposition literature in Great Britain, Cato's letters, for example, against the Walpole government in England. And they come up with all of the reasons why to support a limited government, with limited power, and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is, in many cases, when you get down to the bottom line, these are local demagogues. They are prominent people whose prominence is local. And the only way that they can remain prominent is to prevent the creation of a larger arena. They are big fish in small ponds. They are unwilling to become small fish in a big pond. There's no question that that's there. As an aside, just an observation on my part, the same principle holds in today's political world here in the United States. There is absolutely no question but that many of those who are leading the opposition to big government in 21st century America, many of those who are most opposed to President Obama, to his Affordable Care Act, many of those who are actively supporting the creation of a the calling of a constitutional convention in order to reform the Constitution of the United States, in order to shift power back to the states, many of these folks are driven by the same realities as were the anti-federalists 225 years ago. And that is, the more power they can locate on the state and local level, the more power they control. And I think we need to deal with this political reality. So Madison goes on and says, after this portion of the speech, this view of the subject almost led him to despair, almost led Hamilton to despair, that a Republican government could even be established over so great an extent of territory. He was sensible at the same time that it would be unwise to propose one of any other form. In other words, there was such a commitment to republicanism in the convention that Hamilton believed you had to maintain the illusion of a republic. But the fact of the matter is you had to establish the reality of a monarchy. And for the next portion of his speech, he even puts himself into further trouble. And this is what Madison said. In his private opinion, he had no scruples about declaring that the British government was the best in the world, and that he doubted much whether anything short of it would do in America. Here's Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 telling these delegates that the best government in the world is the government that they just fought a war to get out from under. And that the best thing they could do was structure their own government as close as possible to the British government. Here's the way Madison addresses this part of Hamilton's speech in his notes. He hoped gentlemen of different opinions would bear with him in this, and begged them to recollect the change of opinion on this subject, place, and was still going on. It was once thought that the power of Congress, the members most tenacious of republicanism, he observed, were as loud as any in declaiming against the vices of democracy. This progress of the public mind led him to anticipate the time when others as well as himself would join in the praise bestowed by Mr. Necker on the British Constitution, namely, that it is the only government in the world which unites public strength with individual security. In every community where industry is encouraged, there will be a division of it into the few and the many. Hence, separate interests will arise. I would suggest to you this is exactly what Madison is going to put into his Federalist number 10. In every community where industry is encouraged, there will be a division of it into the few and the many. Hence, separate interests, factions, will arise. There will be debtors and creditors, for example. Give all power to the many, they will oppress the few. Give all power to the few, they will oppress the many. Both, therefore, ought to have power, that each may defend itself against the other. To the want of this check, we owe our paper money, our installment laws, etc. In other words, what Hamilton is saying is everything that's wrong in this country, the paper money laws, the installment laws, the willingness of state governments to interfere with private debts, all of these things we owe to the fact that power is not distributed so that each group in society can protect itself. To the proper adjustment of it, the British owe the excellence of their Constitution. Their House of Lords is a most noble institution, having nothing to hope for by a change and a sufficient interest by means of their property. In being faithful to the national interest, they form a permanent barrier against every pernicious innovation, whether attempted on the part of the Crown or of the Commons. What Hamilton is doing is laying out the beauty of the British structure. The fact that you have a House of Lords, which is comprised of people who are so wealthy and so powerful that they have a vested interest in making sure that nothing changes. They become your guarantee of a stable, secure society. And then he talks about the state of Maryland. The state of Maryland was famous at this time in the 18th century because its constitution contained the indirect election process for its Senate. The state of Maryland was the only state that had an indirect process for electing senators. The people, the voters of Maryland, did not, they elected the General Assembly, but they did not elect the Senate. Rather, they elected electors who elected the Senate. It's the model for the Electoral College and the way we choose our president under the Constitution. The Senate of Maryland is the model for what becomes the Electoral College under the Constitution. In other words, what you do is you allow the people to participate, but you only allow them to participate in choosing the people who will then choose the final senators. It's a step removed, it's a filter to check what is believed to be the extremes of the masses. It's the only way that you can safely allow the masses of people to participate without destroying the whole process. And then Hamilton says, gentlemen differ in their opinions concerning the necessary kind of checks from the different estimates they form of the human passions. They suppose 7 years a sufficient period to give the Senate an adequate firmness, from not duly considering the amazing violence and turbulence of the democratic spirit. When a great object of government is pursued, which seizes the popular passions, they spread like wildfire and become irresistible. You got to have some force, some power to stop that passion of the masses. He appealed to the gentlemen from the New England states, where their experience there had not verified his remarks. As to the executive, he pointed out that what we needed was an executive, a president. He didn't call it a president, he called it an executive, who served on good behavior, which means it was a lifetime appointment. Again, going back to Great Britain, the hereditary interests of the king was so interwoven with that of the nation that he was placed above the danger of being corrupted from abroad, and at the same time was both sufficiently independent and sufficiently controlled. Again, the beauty of the British Constitution, the British monarchy. The monarch was so wealthy that there was nothing to be gained for the monarch by selling out anybody. Therefore, the monarchy could be trusted. But at the same time, it could be controlled because Parliament had the power over legislation. So Hamilton has gone through all of this analysis, and now he comes to his conclusion. And beside this, in the margin, I have written, wow. And I think you'll see why. What is the inference from all of these observations? That we ought to go as far in order to attain stability and permanency as Republican principles will admit. Our goal, Hamilton says in his speech, is to preserve the label of Republican government, but to go as far as possible in the direction of stability and permanency without losing the label of republicanism. In other words, what Hamilton says to this group is the government we create has to be the strongest government we feel we can get away with. Can you believe this? Let one branch of the legislature hold their places for life, or at least during good behavior. Let the executive also be for life. He appealed to the feelings of the members present excuse me, whether a term of 7 years would induce the sacrifices of public affairs, which an acceptance of public trust would require, in order to ensure the services of the best citizens. Therefore, we should have in the Senate, a permanent will. In other words, our Senate needs to be as close to the House of Lords as we can make it. And then Hamilton asked the question, but is this a Republican government? It will be asked. Yes, if all the magistrates are appointed and vacancies are filled by the people, or a process of election originating with the people. What Hamilton is saying is, as long as you allow the people to participate in the process, you can call it republicanism. Tell me that the nature of Republican government, as defined and explained by Montesquieu in his Spirit of the Laws, is not being violated here. Tell me that in the Constitution, which is ratified by the states, in which James Madison played such a prominent part, that he didn't know after hearing this speech that the government coming out of that convention was Republican in name only. At least that was the proposal that Hamilton was making. We need to create the strongest government we can feel we can get away with, is what he's saying. And as long as the people somehow can vote for something, we can call it Republican. As far as the executive goes, some people argue for an executive, the president serving for 7 years. Hamilton believed that that would render the president with little power. He would be ambitious with the means of making creatures. And as the object of his ambition would be to prolong his power, it's probable that in the case of a war, he would avail himself of the emergence to evade or refuse a degradation from his place. The only way to solve it? An executive for life. Then he gets into the meaning of the term monarch. And he said some people are going to say this would be a monarchy. Hamilton says monarch is an indefinite term. He talked about the election of Roman emperors by the army. In Poland, the election of the monarch is by the rival princes. In the German Empire, it's by the competing princes. And then Hamilton raises the question, might not such a mode of election be devised among ourselves as will defend the community against these effects in any dangerous degree? In other words, can't we come up with something here that allows us to create an executive for life and avoid the negativism that's going to be outside, the people are going to express when they start calling it a monarchy? Surely we can come up with something, he says. And then Hamilton reaches his conclusion. And I'm going to read the concluding part of Madison's notes. Having made these observations, Madison says, he would read to the committee a sketch of a plan which he should prefer to either of those under consideration. He was aware that it went beyond the ideas of most members. But will such a plan be adopted out of doors? In other words, is there any way in the world that the people outside this room will buy into this? He says, in return, he would ask, will the people out there adopt the other plan? At present, they will adopt neither. But he sees the Union dissolving or already dissolved. He sees evils operating in the states which must soon cure the people of their fondness for democracies. He sees that a great progress has been already made and is still going on in the public mind. He thinks, therefore, that the people in time will be unshackled from their prejudices. And whenever that happens, they will themselves not be satisfied at stopping where the plan of Mr. Randolph would place them, but be ready to go as far at least as he proposes. Hamilton concludes his speech by saying, most of you would believe that the people out there would never buy this. But let me tell you, the nation is changing. The public mind is changing. People are becoming aware that their fondness for democracy and mass participation is not working. More and more people are coming around to where I'm speaking from. And once they do that, they're not going to want to stop with the Virginia plan presented by Mr. R. Randolph. They're going to go to where I am. And then he presents his plan. We have about 8 or 9 minutes left in our program. So I'm going to move through this very quickly, and we can pick up tomorrow and review some of the details of this plan in particular. But it's not long. This is Hamilton's proposed Constitution. The supreme legislative power of the United States of America to be vested in two different bodies of men, one to be called the Assembly, the other the Senate, who together shall form the legislature of the United States, with power to pass all laws whatsoever subject to the negative hereafter mentioned. So they have the power to pass all laws. But somewhere there's going to be a negative. Somebody's going to have the power to say no. He said, we'll get to that. Number 2, the Assembly to consist of persons elected by the people to serve for 3 years. As you know, now our House of Representatives is every 2 years. 3, the Senate to consist of persons elected to serve during good behavior. Listen to this. This is the way you choose the Senate. The Senate to consist of persons elected to serve during good behavior. That means for life. Their election to be made by electors chosen for that purpose by the people. The Maryland plan. In other words, you do not give the people the direct power to choose their senators. You give the people the right to choose electors who in turn will choose the senators for life. But there's another part. In order to this, the states to be divided into election districts. In other words, you divide up the states into electoral districts. What you're doing is filtering the impact of the people through so many different filters that for all practical purposes they can't really have an effect on who sits in the United States Senate. This is one of the major proposals that we have changed in our Constitution. In the early 20th century, during the Progressive period, we gave the power to elect senators to the people. Now the proposed amendment, the so-called Liberty Amendments by Mark Levin, wants to return to this system and take it away from the people. That's the Senate. You can see exactly where Hamilton's coming from. He's got so many checks built into the selection of the Senate that he effectively has recreated a model of the House of Lords. 4th, the supreme executive authority of the United States to be vested in a governor to be elected to serve during good behavior for life, the election to be made by electors chosen by the people, the Electoral College, in the election districts aforesaid. In other words, the president will be chosen the same way that the members of the Senate will be chosen. The authorities and functions of the executive to be as follows. The executive will have a negative on all laws about to be passed, and the execution of all laws passed. In other words, the president will have the power to veto any law Congress passes. Power in the executive branch, Hamilton. House of Lords, Hamilton. Lifetime appointments, Hamilton. Indirect participation. To the George Will article we looked at a number of weeks ago, in which George Will quoted from Federalist 85 written by Hamilton and tried to argue that Hamilton was concerned about the power of the federal government and wanted to find a way to make sure the states had the power to check the central government. That is absolutely wrong. This is Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton would have no checks on the power of the central government if he felt he could get away with it. He said that. What George Will, what the Tea Party interests, what the advocates for a second constitutional convention are advocating here, they are trying to appropriate the founders. They are trying to take Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison and the rest of them and make them supporters of their agenda. They are not. And I think this speech by Hamilton says it all. Now, granted, it goes way beyond where most members of the convention are willing to go. Hamilton admits that. But on the other hand, he says the times are changing. And there's going to come a time when you're going to be right where I am. And the people are going to be there too. And he says, I can see it happening now. And he's right. So the president will have an absolute veto over all laws. The president will have the power to direct war when authorized or begun, to have, with the advice and appropriation of the Senate, the power of making all treaties, the sole appointment of the heads of chief officers of the Departments of Finance, War, and Foreign Affairs, the nomination of all other officers, ambassadors to foreign nations included, subject to the appropriation or rejection of the Senate, and the power of pardoning all offenses except treason, which he shall not pardon without the appropriation of the Senate. So he can even pardon treason, but he has to have Senate approval for it. Fifth, on the death, resignation, or removal of the governor, the president becomes the president, his authority to be exercised by the president of the Senate until a successor is appointed. The Senate will have the sole power of declaring war, the power of advising and approving all treaties, the power of approving or rejecting all appointments of officers except the heads or chiefs of the Departments of Finance, War, and Foreign Affairs. If you are beginning to see similarities between what's in Hamilton's proposal here and what ends up in the Constitution of the United States, I think you are beginning to see that while there was shock at the convention at Hamilton's speech, the fact of the matter is what the convention ends up doing in many cases follows Hamilton's advice to the letter. Much of the convention that comes, much of the Constitution that comes out of this convention reflects elements of what Hamilton is proposing here. So they may have been shocked when he said it on the 18th of June, but by the 17th of September, they were willing to go home to their states and sell this baby. Then he talks about what becomes the Supreme Court. The judicial authority is to be vested in judges who hold their offices during good behavior for life. But this is the difference. The legislature, this is number 8, the legislature of the United States will have the power, legislature of the United States, not the state legislatures. This is how much more powerful the central government would have under Hamilton's proposals. I want to get to number 11. There are only 12, and we only have 3 minutes left, so 2 minutes left. So let me read number 11. This is the last thing, and I have a wow beside it because I think it's significant. All laws of the particular states contrary to the Constitution or laws of the United States to be utterly void. In other words, if Hamilton's plan was adopted, no state would be permitted to have a law contrary to the Constitution of the United States. And the better to prevent such laws being passed, the governor or president of each state shall be appointed by the general government and have a negative upon the laws about to be passed in the state of which he is governor or president. The people of the states would not elect the governors. Congress would. Congress would choose the head of every state government as well as the members of the national government. And then finally, no state would have its own militia. The militia of all the states would be under the sole and exclusive direction of the United States. That is Hamilton's plan. If some of it sounds familiar, it's because it is. We have reached 58 minutes after the hour, so we're going to basically take this opportunity to thank you for tuning in to the Virtual Center today. I want to thank you. I hope you have a wonderful evening. I've given you a lot of information today. I think it's information that you will do well to reflect upon and think about. We'll come back tomorrow with another program. We'll be back at our regular starting time tomorrow, 1 p.m. in the East, and we'll review some of this and we'll make a few comments upon it. And again, we have our phone number where you can also share your comments and your thoughts on this plan of government proposed by Alexander Hamilton. For Bob Kincaid and the folks at the Head On Radio Network, I'm Bill O'Brien. Thank you so very, very much for tuning in today. Have a wonderful day, and hopefully we can get back together again tomorrow. Thank you.